You know, I've been doing Mario videos for well over a year now. Sounds like a recipe for a downward spiral mentally and losing your mind completely, and in some ways that's kinda true. But as I say in all of these videos, I'm doing it because this is my favorite series in all of gaming. It's one I've loved ever since I was very little, so naturally it's one of the major factors for me deciding to switch from doing those old, and I want to put massive air quotes around this, comedy videos, to talking about stuff I want to talk about. With that in mind, you think playing absolutely every game in this series would be near the top of my ever so out of order priorities list, but you'd be surprised to know that's not exactly true. I've loved these games for years, and within the last half-decade have focused on both experiencing the ones I had yet to play, and revisiting those I had trouble with in the past to finally complete them for myself. But sometimes outside factors prevent me from doing so, no matter how much I want to dive into one I hadn't yet experienced. Okay, so why am I telling you all this crap? You've probably already clicked away to watch something else. Oh, this guy fucking does this bullshit and has started video. Well, it's all a perfect setup for the game I'll be discussing today. Those who have watched and enjoyed even a single episode of this marathon, thank you to anyone who's done that, we're probably looking forward to this moment, but yeah, I finally reached Super Mario Odyssey. I'm sure for many people, this game needs no introduction. Jeez, it feels like I say that in every video I make, but in this case, it's especially true. Super Mario Odyssey is in the conversation for best game in the series for many people. Development on Odyssey began sometime after Super Mario 3D World, during the Wii U's twilight years. Contrary to what some believe, the game actually wasn't in development for Wii U. I won't blame people for having this misconception though. It makes sense when you think about it, and after all, Zelda Breath of the Wild was a Wii U game at first. So then what platform was it being developed for? It's a bit of a story, so bear with me here. You all know what happened with the Wii U. I briefly went into it in the previous video anyway, so I won't go over it again. For that, I like to direct you to numerous other videos or articles on what went wrong with that console. Suffice to say, it was a financial disaster. Nintendo decided to cut their losses and get off the sinking ship while they still could. In the background, they began research and development on their next game system. Rather than completely abandoning their ideas upon even the slightest taste of criticism like cowards, however, their next console would essentially be a second attempt at the Wii U's concept. Really, the Wii U was a good idea. You can play it on your TV, using the gamepad as a second screen like it's a scaled up DS or something. Or you can swap to a mode that lets you play the game on the gamepad if someone wants to use the TV for something else, with the off TV play mode. I think you're starting to see what I'm getting at here. The Wii U's problem then was how it was handled. Its marketing was poor to say the least, and the gamepad still had to be within a certain range of the console itself to play in off-TV mode. A prime case of a great idea with questionable execution. So seeing these easily fixable flaws, Nintendo just decided to do things over again. Of course, the new system was in the planning phase shortly after the Wii U came out in 2012, because that's just how business works, but the latter's poor sales likely served as a wake-up call of sorts. Nintendo said their plans for the next one started with the question, what kind of new experience can we create? Word came out that a new system was being developed in response to the financial losses during the Wii U era, codenamed the NX. In 2016, the NX was unveiled as the Nintendo Switch, and it would be a hybrid console. Like the Wii U, it had two modes, TV and portable, but unlike the Wii U, the concept would be refined and fully fleshed out. Rather than being a typical system with an awkward gamepad you can only play on within your house, the Switch would itself be a tablet. It could be plugged into a special dock connected to a TV with HDMI to play like any other home console, or you could take it like any other handheld. Obviously, this presents the problem of controllers and how those will work, and Nintendo came up with an ingenious solution. The console has two controllers that can slide onto its sides, complete with three modes themselves. It has your typical handheld and TV modes, the latter of which has this controller shell you can use, and a tabletop mode. The tablet even has a kickstand, so they truly accounted for all play experiences. As the console's tagline goes, play anywhere, anytime. The Switch wasn't the first ever hybrid console, but it was the first one to achieve widespread popularity. The Switch got actually decent marketing, and as soon as it released in early 2017, it sold like crazy, which continues on to this very day. In fact, the Switch went on to outsell the original Wii, believe it or not. I'd like to imagine a certain announcement contributed to a lot of this hype. I'm referring to what else but Super Mario Odyssey. This game was teased in 2016 and officially unveiled in 2017, and by E3 that year, the full trailer was shown. It was in this promotional material that the game's ace in the hole, its most significant feature, was unveiled. There was a realistic city level. Hey, remember when Sonic did that and people bitched about it, but then now Mario does it? It's the greatest thing ever? Nice standards you got there. But in all seriousness, the game's main gameplay feature would be Cappy. Mario's hat itself would become a character, and you would throw it at enemies to take control of them. Not a wholly original idea for a game, but it certainly was for Mario. The thing that perked many fans' eyebrows, however, was the approach to level design. Odyssey would be returning to the traditional collectathon stuff from the early days of 3D Mario. Hype started to build from that alone, because lots of core fans were waiting years for another game like that. So finding out the next game would be just that, complete with an idea that could lead to tons of interesting ideas, they probably felt felt like preemptively tossing money at the stage. The game would come out in October 2017, and was plastered with amazing scores. Many critics said it was the best 3D Mario game since Galaxy, and pushed the series forward a lot, and fans were similarly enthusiastic. However, some would later stick out their necks and give more negative takes. It isn't as controversial as many other games, but there is at least some debate surrounding it. How it reinvented the collectathon formula in the Mario series, whether its systems are fleshed out, the size of its content, and so on. Despite that, it remains one of the series' most beloved games, right up there with the 2D stuff in Galaxy. So that's them. What about me? That is what you clicked on this video to find out. After all, anyway, I didn't play Super Mario Odyssey when it came out. I wasn't involved in the hype cycle. In fact, I missed it by several months. I got back into Mario in August 2017, and even then it took several months to fully rediscover my love for the series. That's not to say I was unaware of the Switch or Odyssey. I was starting to watch gaming content on YouTube again, so they were kind of unavoidable. I thought it looked interesting, but I had no desire to buy a Switch because I was deep in the retro gaming rabbit hole. That was until 2020 when I would finally get the urge to play Odyssey. I beat almost every Mario game by then, many more than once, and I wanted more. So I got myself a Switch along with a copy of Odyssey. It was the first game I played on a post-3DS Nintendo system, and I thought it was fantastic. It was refreshing to play a sandbox-based Mario I wasn't ridiculously familiar with, and I enjoyed the cappy mechanic. It also had several improvements from the older 3D Mario games. On the other hand, it also had some aspects I thought were weaker than the other ones, things that not many others were really pointing out. But like 3D World, that was a while ago. I haven't touched Super Mario Odyssey since 2020. In that original playthrough, I was doing the post-game, but I also got into Animal Crossing around then, and that kind of consumed like 4 months of my life. By early 2021, I knew I wanted to cover this series, so I held off on playing the game until now. Coincidentally, this marathon just so happened to line up with this game's 5th anniversary. I basically couldn't have picked a better time to cover it. So with that said, here we go, my review of Super Mario Odyssey. This is one I've been anticipating since my coverage of Super Mario 64. By the end of this video, I want to answer one simple question. Does Super Mario Odyssey hold up 5 years after it was originally released? Sit back, relax, possibly grab something to eat, and most importantly, enjoy yourself. Immediately when you begin the game, it's clear Nintendo set out to create a great first impression. It opens up on this tense fight between Mario and Bowser. This scene is one of the best cutscenes in the series history, and we aren't even past the first 5 minutes. It kinda reminds me of the opening to Sonic Unleashed, although admittedly it's less action-packed than that. Bowser was presumably in the middle of his usual activities, you know, being a creep and taking the princess, and Mario is now trying to stop it. He appears dressed up fancily for some reason, and manages to take Mario out with one swing of his hat. Mario got waxed so far away that his own iconic hat fell off, which Bowser crushes under his feet. He then reveals that, holy shit, he's setting up a wedding with Peach this time around. It's clear he means business more than ever, and actually appears to have won. Mario's hat is then shredded in his airship's propellers as he flies away, while a strange ghost-like creature picks up its remains and appears distraught. So yeah, this game does have the stock plot of Peach got taken away by Bowser, oh no, we have to save her again. It's all but cliche at this point. I've been continuously pointing it out in this video series, but it's stunning how repetitive and unimaginative the storytelling in this series became. However, in this case, I don't feel the same way. Like Sunshine in the Galaxy games, Odyssey actually has more meat and bones on its plot. That's not to say it's The Last of Us or Half-Life or something in terms of lore and story. The story is still relatively simple. The key element that makes it stick out in my mind then is the presentation. Put simply, it's presented in such an interesting fashion. This opening cutscene alone looks spectacular. Its animation is very smooth and natural feeling, a step up from the CG cutscenes of old. Galaxy 1 certainly comes close and had the more spectacular events. I mean, it's kind of hard to beat a gigantic fuck-off UFO emerging and carrying Peach's castle into deep space. But Odyssey's animation allows it to win out. Bowser also comes off as legitimately menacing this time around, what with beating the crap out of Mario in the beginning and seemingly winning. It manages to describe the dynamic between these two characters and establish the stakes this time around so well, and with minimal voice acting to boot. Speaking of the stakes, I love how they made this game centered around stopping Bowser from marrying Peach, and how they never lose sight of what they were doing throughout the game. The previous games all featured Bowser trying to usurp the throne and take over the entire world with his armies, but you never felt that presence because of how minimal the story was. In this game, every place you travel to has some sort of reminder of the fact Bowser is trying to marry the princess. He sends his armies to those various kingdoms and has them take important objects from them, most of which serve as things he plans to use in his wedding. You know, stuff like flowers and a huge ring and all that. It actually feels like things are at serious risk if Mario doesn't complete his quest as soon as possible, motivating the player to keep moving throughout the game. Again, I wouldn't call it high art, but what I would call it is excellent for a platforming game. Sorry, I got a bit lost in the analysis kind of early. Where was I? Oh yeah, Mario crash lands in a strange new area as that bizarre ghost-like hat creature teacher looks over his unconscious body. Mario suddenly wakes up, startling him, and he runs away as Mario chases after him. Once the hat guy realizes Mario means well, he explains what's going on. His name is Cappy, and he's a part of this odd race of hat people. Bowser came in and ravaged the place they were currently in, the Cap Kingdom, stealing Cappy's sister Tiara. The two both had something taken away from them by this one monster, so they agree to help each other out. Noticing Mario's now uncovered head, Cappy hops onto it, but Mario still misses his original cap. No worries, Cappy takes the shredded bit of it he managed to salvage and immediately takes its shape. And there it is, Super Mario Odyssey's ace in the hole, Cappy. I'll talk more about him in a bit, but suffice to say I like the idea of Mario having a companion character. Almost every 3D game in this series past SM64 had one of these. Sunshine had Flood, Galaxy, and Galaxy 2 had the Master Luma, and now Odyssey has Cappy. Now that's a tradition I'm glad they stuck to. The two make their way through the Cap Kingdom, during which Mario discovers Cappy's ability to take control of other life forms. They're soon ambushed by a gang of rabbits working for Bowser. They call themselves the Brutals, and they'll be the primary mini-bosses throughout the game. Man, am I glad it isn't the Koopalings again. That was starting to get really old. Mario captures an electrical wire, turning into a power surge, and then sets off on his journey proper. He ends up in a weird prehistoric area with an old broken down ship called the Odyssey. Oh, I wonder why they called it that.
I wonder, guys. You have any idea why they called it that?
Anyway, the ship is powered by these odd moon-like objects called power moons. Yeah, it looks like they just decided on the next space-themed object to use for the main collectible. I appreciate it being something else than Power Stars, which were admittedly starting to get a little cliche themselves, though. The duo then collect a few moons and bring them back to the Odyssey, power it up, which is now ready to travel to another kingdom. Mario and Cappy set off on their journey, scouring the various kingdoms of the world for as many moons as possible, as they do everything they can to save their inhabitants from Bowser's army, planning to attack Bowser and put a stop to his wedding as they do. I personally really love this journey across the world premise. Hell, the back of the box even looks like a vacation photo album. I don't know if it's because it reminds me of Sunshine, but I like it a lot either way. Jumping into this game feels fantastic, because they've absolutely nailed the controls this time around. After Sunshine, these games have found different ways to fail to live up to its level of satisfying control. The Galaxy Duo controlled fine, but were slightly sluggish and more stiff by comparison. 3D Land was absolutely awful in this regard, with its clunky movement and disgustingly bad physics. 3D World was far better than that, and it wasn't too shabby, but it still relied on a run button and still had a more limited moveset. Odyssey finally brings the series back to having controls that are fun to even aimlessly mess around with. That tends to be the test I judge many of these games with, and I'm sure you've noticed it. I love it when a 3D platforming game plays into the strengths of the genre, featuring a satisfying moveset that you can just engage with for fun. Mario's physics in this game are near perfect. It feels like you can do anything with his jumps that are perfectly balanced between being floaty and heavy. Mario also turns and stops on a dime. He accelerates very naturally, and there's actual 360-degree push the stick to move faster analog control. Thank God, the run button really started to irritate me in the last two games. I'm glad Nintendo remembered how to program the same analog controls they pioneered decades ago, or at least shook the need to dumb down their game's controls to appeal to casual audiences. In fact, they said they wanted to appeal more to core fans than casuals in the pre-release, so that's cool. I didn't really know where to begin when discussing this game's moveset. It's so simple, yet so complex in the various ways it can be used and applied. Odyssey is a prominent case of the SM64 principle, where a seemingly simple moveset has this insane potential that allows skilled players to do lots of crazy shit. Odyssey brings back the combo jumps, allowing you to press jump as you land to go higher. It also has side flips, wall jumps, the long jump, a new ground pound jump that gives you a shot of upward momentum if you jump after pounding, and even the Sunshine spin jump. However, and this is my favorite, the dive and the ledge grabber back. About fucking time, don't you think? I could spend hours dissecting many of these moves and providing use case after use case, but really, it's all up to the player. What I do one way can possibly be done 1,000 others by those who can think creatively enough, mostly because I'm a big fucking idiot who doesn't know how to do anything. Odyssey has some of the most free-flowing movement from the whole series. It just feels so good to chain long jumps, dives, triple jumps, and whatever else together. If there's anything I don't like, the dive now requires you to ground pound in midair before pressing the action button. It's an extra input that's easy to remember but odd to get used to. I also find that the dive is fixed speed and not quite the same as it used to be because of it. Double and triple jump dives are one of my favorite parts of the older games, and it's a shame it's still a relic of the past. Oh well, I still found the dive useful in numerous moments, whether I had to reach a high ledge or save myself from a pit. The extra button may have something to do with Cappy as well, so it's understandable. I also don't like how certain actions are tied to motion controls, such as climbing up poles faster. I played this game with a controller after getting tired of the Joy-Cons, and just my luck, the controller doesn't have motion capabilities, so I had to sit and wait for Mario to slowly climb poles. It feels so shoehorned to me. Otherwise, this game controls very well. By the way, I mentioned Cappy just there, which, yeah, speaking of him, Mario's movement is yet again not limited to his superhuman acrobatics. Those things are fine on their own, as Super Mario 64 demonstrates, but it's always cool when these games include extra mechanics that make each game stand out, while not detracting or compromising the identity of the franchise in any way. Cappy is another worthy addition to that list. Me being the contrarian I am, I still prefer Flood overall because the hover nozzle was just that great. Cappy is no slouch though. Pressing the action button allows you to toss him, which can have a couple effects depending on the situation. You can grab items or activate switches in the distance, which is is even used in some neat challenges every now and then. Mario can also jump off of Cappy with a pretty simple set of inputs. You jump, throw your hat, making sure to press and not hold the Y button, and then press ZL or ZR for a ground pound and then Y or X after that, which makes you dive into Cappy and bounce off of it. This move is fun to mess around with. It lets you move fairly quickly if you can get the inputs down, which I made sound super complicated, but they really aren't. And if you're feeling extra ballsy, you can even chain them together to pull off insane skips. I'm nowhere near skilled enough to do anything crazy like that, but for what it's worth, I don't get tired of doing this move. But that's not what Cappy is really known for, nor what the game's marketing is all about. No. He was included because of a genius new idea they had for gameplay, the capture mechanic. I already mentioned this, but here it is, the main selling point of Super Mario Odyssey, besides something else I'll touch on in a bit. If you throw Cappy and there's an enemy in his way, you would expect him to just take it out. In some cases, this does happen, but most others is where the mechanic comes in. Mario gets to take control of the enemy as it gains his features, like a mustache and red hat. When controlling the enemies, you get to use their abilities, which can in turn be used in puzzles, platforming challenges, exploration, and stuff like that. I mentioned that taking control of enemies isn't a wholly new idea. I can think of a few examples, like the gadgets that let you command enemies from the Ratchet series, or the bug bait from Half-Life 2. Of course, most of these don't operate in the same way Odyssey does, but you get the idea. That said, I think this game's take on the idea is the best I've seen yet. My favorite part about this entire thing is the variety it introduces. Not in a gameplay sense, although that's absolutely true as well, and I find it impressive how they managed to keep the game fresh the whole way through despite being simple in the grand scheme of things. But rather, a lot of the variety comes from the enemy roster. The classic staples that have always been there are included, but unlike games from the past few years before this, there's actually original enemies and characters all over the place to look at. Nintendo took an ideas first approach to thinking of enemy transformations. That is, they thought of the mechanics first, and then decided on what enemy would be the best fit for it, instead of rehashing the same enemies all over again and shoehorning in half-baked mechanics that make no sense for what the enemy is. If an ability didn't fit a pre-established foe, they just think of a new one. For example, the uproots. The developers decided they wanted to have an enemy that lets you use stretchable legs to rise. Instead of forcing this into an existing enemy and breaking the laws of reality, they decided on a plant because that just makes sense. Same for the Gushins. They wanted you to be able to fly for a short time and chose a squid that can do so with powerful water spouts. I'd also be damned if I didn't mention the gigantic fucking T-Rex you get to control, which is one of the most metal things I've seen in a Mario game. The capture system kinda reminds me of the transformations from Banjo-Kazooie, come to think of it, being temporary extensions to your moveset. I think it's the best when there's sections designed around a certain enemy's abilities, as it lets their mechanical strengths shine. Really, I don't know if I can possibly add anything to this conversation that hasn't already been said. You've probably heard all this stuff before, but I don't care about that. If I'm passionate about something and I want to talk about it, I'm gonna do it, even if I don't end up saying anything new. That's why I started doing this video series in the first place. I can sit here and list excellent uses of the capture system because the game is chock full of them. There's even a few instances where you get to control inanimate objects. Usually this is just a short, move object out of the way puzzle or disguised loading screen, but it's kind of funny at least. I find it hard to complain about the capture system, really, because it's just so well integrated. It feels like the next step after the Gravity of the Galaxy games, as it offers so much potential for fun gameplay situations. As is, it does that excellently, but I feel like it's just scratching the proverbial surface of what the mechanic is even capable of. Now here's a point that seemingly everyone, even diehard fans of the game like Donkey, bring up, and like them I have to toss my hat into the ring for this one and agree. What am I doing? This game does its core mechanic well, exceptionally well if you ask me, but it feels like more could have been done. I mean, most enemies are used for only a few things. Imagine if they were used for all they were worth, fleshing out every last one of their abilities. If that would get repetitive, and it probably would after a while, how about being able to combine captures together? Yeah, there's an idea you probably heard before from a million other people, but I don't care, it's a good idea. For example, what if you could take a Bullet Bill and Hammer Bro and use them to become a flying death machine? Or how about a Wiggler or a Fireball with literally anything to gain stretchiness or fireproofing? I'm horrible at thinking of these ideas, but you see what I mean. What's here is great stuff, but there's no doubt in my mind that there's a goldmine of untapped potential lurking under these amazing yet surprisingly simple mechanics. This game's levels take place in such varied locations with their own enemies, so I can't begin to estimate how much they could have done. Although, speaking of that, I have had quite the bone to pick with this series' aesthetics for a while now. After the Galaxy era passed, some switch in the collective conscience of Nintendo's developers flipped and made them incapable of crafting interesting and varied worlds like they used to. Mario and its spin-offs were once a bastion of creativity, but it had rather quickly dried up into a series that reused the same level ideas and aesthetics over and 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 over again. I wouldn't say any of these games' graphics are bad, but Christ are they uninspired. The new Super Mario Bros. Games were the culmination of this, and so was 3D Land. They all used the same aesthetics, the same general art style, the works. Even in a game like 3D World, which had insanely beautiful visuals objectively, still managed to feel stale because of its reliance on these same old tropes, which makes me very glad to report that Super Mario Odyssey doesn't fall into this trap. Even when it reuses classic themes like deserts or forests, it recontextualizes them into something original and engaging. An absolute breath of fresh air. On a surface level, Super Mario Odyssey has spectacular visual presentation. There's the cutscenes, which I already discussed, but also the graphics on their own. I can't see a single jagged edge or imperfection in the entire thing. It all just looks so clean. Unfortunately, even in docked mode, it runs at a 900p resolution, which is technically HD, but not exactly ideal. That's sadly kind of the standard for the Switch as far as I understand. It's on par with mobile hardware, and thus in a graphically intense game as this, it can't go any higher. They probably could have gotten away with 1080p if they lowered the frame rate to compensate, but they wanted to target 60 FPS so they had to compromise with the resolution. Such is the nature of trade-offs in software development. You can't perfectly optimize everything because we live in an imperfect world. Oh well, I'm fine with it. I'm not a huge resolution freak, and besides, that 60 FPS is pretty damn consistent. In certain areas, I felt minor drops into the 50s or maybe the high 40s, but that's the lowest it gets. For the most part, even with its gigantic world, Super Mario Odyssey maintains a silky smooth frame rate. I appreciate it when games do this. It's one of the reasons the Dreamcast version of Sonic Adventure 1 is the weakest to me, and no one can change my mind on that. Sorry, I don't know how that one got in the script. Frame rate makes a huge difference in the smoothness of games, and I'm sure this is a huge factor as to why Odyssey feels so good to play. And it's an early release for such limited hardware too. So yeah, the game is a technical achievement for the Switch, but what I truly love about how this game looks is its art style. Super Mario Odyssey's level aesthetics are simply way more creative than most of the series. In fact, I call this the most inventive Mario game since the Galaxy days. Even the first kingdom, which yes, if you haven't caught on yet, this game's levels are kingdoms, is a perfect example. It's this grayscale sky dimension with fog and weird abstract landforms all over the place. From the offset, it's enough to catch your eyes. As I said, classic archetypes are also refitted to be more original. The Sand Kingdom seems like it would be your typical scorching desert stage, nothing to see here. But when you get there, it's freezing cold and has tons of ice pillars everywhere. Bowser stole the statue's ring. For Christ's sake, Bowser, get a real ring for once. Fucking Mickey Mouse. Like I was saying, and him doing that caused the place to run cold. The Wooded Kingdom is another prime example of this. It seems like it will be a callback to the Forest of Illusion, but it isn't. There's this odd steampunk-like base here, complete with bizarre robots and creatures. And tanks, that too. Yeah, you can control these things, by the way. They're fun to use, but holy hell are the controls weird to get used to. I also like the Seaside Kingdom a lot, no shit, because it reminds me of Sunshine. Case closed on that one. Of course, how could I go a Super Mario Odyssey review without mentioning the most iconic level of all? The one everyone was anticipating from the very start. The one nobody could shut up about. Why, it's the Cloud Kingdom, of course. Wait, what do you mean that wasn't? Right. Yeah, you saw this one coming. The Metro Kingdom, otherwise known as New Donk City. This is a new one for Mario. He's had cities before, but never one that looks straight out of real life. This level is modeled after what else but New York City, that hellhole, I mean city from the home state of yours truly. There's skyscrapers, complete with knockoffs of iconic landmarks like the Empire State Building and the Fuller Building, taxis, motorcycles that you can ride, and yes, realistic human beings that speak in gibberish. It was a bit funny to see at first, but honestly, I think this is my favorite level in the game aesthetically. It's just so cool for Mario to run around in this environment, and I like how it's a city suspended on even larger buildings below, extending down for God knows how long. A lot of people seem to agree with that too, which is rich to say the least. I'm talking about that semi-joking Sonic comparison I made earlier, but really, it's funny to me that these people will complain about Sonic traveling to real-world inspired cities. Oh, it's Sonic does it, it's the worst thing ever. But when Mario does it, perfectly fine. No problem, nothing to see here. Of course, some people were weirded out about it in the re-release, but you see what I mean. Anyway, enough of that bullshit. I think it's a neat level aesthetic for a Mario game, which applies to pretty much every level in the entire game. Also, I mentioned the music in there, so let's talk about that. Awful transition aside, this game's music is spectacular. It manages to blend atmospheric sound, catchy melodies, and a jazzy Mario feel so perfectly that it's hard to fully quantify. It's music that just feels good to listen to, both in and out of the game. Some tracks are simply good, while the ones that stand out really stand out. I already showed the Metro Kingdom's music back there, but how about the theme for a place like the Wooded Kingdom, with its unique instruments and catchy composition? Or if you want something more chill, the Seaside Kingdom has you covered. if you want to start crying over an oddly nostalgic atmosphere despite the song sounding only vaguely like stuff you've heard before yet it still manages to almost bring you to tears because of how strangely familiar and sentimental it is, The Lost Kingdom is for you. I also love tracks like the Jaxi theme, which in particular blends exotic instruments and catchy melodies masterfully. There's of course way more than just those examples, but if I played them all for you, we'd be here all day, so I'm moving on. And of course, there's no way I can avoid mentioning the vocal tracks. This is the first Mario game to have a vocal theme song called Jump Up Superstar. It's sung by Pauline. Pauline returns from the original Donkey Kong as the mayor of New Donk City, and in this game she has aspirations of being a singer. It's a bit weird hearing a Mario song that includes vocals, but I have to admit, I think the song is great. The jazzy instrumentals are very fitting for Mario, and the singing is very well done. There's also one more vocal song in the game, but I'll save that for later when it's more relevant. In general, this game has a great soundtrack. It's right up there with the best music the series has to offer, and I can see why some people call it the best soundtrack Mario has ever had. Anyway, back to the gameplay. I was discussing Cappy and the capture system, which is all well and good, but what's the point of the playground to get to use those things isn't up to par? Well, then you have a game with a great backbone, but a poor body, but regardless, I think I've made my point here on the importance of stage design in platforming games in too many videos. I won't repeat it here. Long story short, if a platforming game drops the ball with the whole platforming thing, that's not exactly a good thing because it is the namesake after all. Super Mario Odyssey is a complicated beast to talk about, and I don't mean that in a bad way. There's just so much going on in these levels. They're overall very large, but also tightly packed and generally content-rich. I'll start with the foundation and then work my way up from there. In the late 2000s and throughout the 2010s, the Mario series began to prioritize casual players. General audiences and mass appeal were valued over the core fan base and innovation. 3D Mario games from the start were based on the collectathon formula. Super Mario 64 essentially pioneered that genre, and Sunshine expanded on it and refined it with its own ideas. After that point, things began a trajectory towards linearity. Now, I have to make something clear. Straightforward levels based on obstacle course gameplay are not inherently bad. That style of level design has many strengths of its own. Ease of development, wider appeal, tighter platforming challenges, and the like. Also, having open-ended gameplay isn't inherently good. But I personally think that something was lost in this transition. I, for one, love the collectathon gameplay style. It's very much a completionist genre built around the potential for speedrunning. I'm not even a completionist, nor am I a speedrunner, but there's nothing more satisfying than collecting everything in these games just that slightest bit quicker, all because of your own navigation skills. Linear stage-based games miss out on that satisfaction and feel a lot more limited by comparison. This was an issue in the Mario series for several years. It all started in Galaxy, which was the first step towards 3D Mario distancing itself from its roots. Galaxy 2 leaned further into this direction, and by 3D Land, they just went full-on New Super Mario Bros., but in 3D. Super Mario 3D World is a lot better than its direct predecessor, but it was still a lot more restrictive than the Galaxy Duo, which were themselves more restricted than the stuff that came before. Core fans understandably wanted more of that type of action, but they would have to wait through years and years of nothing but New Super Mario Bros. Rehashing as the 3D series began to degenerate into much of the same. What was once the pinnacle of creativity in this series had shriveled up and become yet another victim of Nintendo's strict over-adherence to formulas and tradition. Call it an effect of the Wii's immense financial success in the casual market, call it a response to some of the frankly unfair backlash the collectathon genre would receive, but whatever it was, it caused a noticeable change in the identity of this series. Okay, it really wasn't all that serious, it's just video games, but I can see why some became so fatigued. Doing this marathon, I started to feel much the same way with many of these later games. It just got so tiring to play, it felt like the same thing over and over again, which is exactly why I, like many others were back in 2017, am glad that Super Mario Odyssey grew some balls and dared to do something creative yet again. Odyssey brings back the collectathon formula in full force. It features open-ended stages with numerous power moons hidden within. Progression is tied to how many moons you have. Like Galaxy, the number is contextualized as powering up a ship, as I mentioned earlier, the Odyssey, and new levels are unlocked by powering it up with enough moons. I must say, I really miss this structure. Super Mario 64 was the only one in the entire series to fully commit to it. Not even my favorite game in the series, Sunshine, had a 100% ideal collectathon structure, as it was more mission-based and progression was tied to having the 7th shine in every level. Shine amounts in that game were used to unlock stuff like the nozzles or Yoshi. Even then, Super Mario Odyssey offers an even greater amount of freedom than Super Mario 64. 64. In that game, there were certain objectives that can only be accessed by selecting the correct star or collecting an earlier one, such as Snowman's big head or to the top of the fortress. Odyssey's moons, at least all the base ones, in each kingdom anyway, are all accessible from the beginning of the level. Some do have these odd conditions that have to be satisfied in other stages, but for the most part, you can sweep roughly 90% of any given level's moons in one go. What helps with this is the single most significant improvement Odyssey makes over the older collectathons, and it's a feature that really should have been there from the start. It doesn't kick you out of the level after collecting something. In Sunshine, this was more logical because of the subplot focused structure, that is, where every level had its own sub-story to the main one, but in Super Mario 64 with its more Banjo-esque progression, it comes off as archaic and aged, and was a little more than a thinly disguised padding to obfuscate the game's short length, which by the way is still only around 3 to 4 hours to get all 120 stars, even with all the bootouts. This was especially an issue later in the game when some of the levels became obstacle course-like, as they require you to play the same sections repeatedly to get 100%. Rainbow Ride was the worst offender easily, having carpet rides that collectively last several minutes. Super Mario Odyssey, by contrast, has none of that. It takes a page from Sunshine in that every last one of its main stages is open, rather than just a majority of them. It also, as I said, is the first 3D Mario game to keep you in the level after you grab a moon. Mario does his animation, and like the 100 coin stars in Super Mario 64, you'll be able to continue on and collect more moons. It's for this reason that Odyssey feels more like a Banjo game than a spiritual successor to 64. Funny that it took the series this long to do this, but I'm glad it made the change, as it improves the pacing significantly. It also allows you to warp between checkpoints from the main menu, making tracking down collectibles in these large environments very manageable if you know where to go. So how are those levels? To be honest, while I think they're overall great and make several steps up from the older games, I also think they take a few steps back from what the older games were doing. Odyssey breaks roughly even with them for me in terms of being a more open 3D Mario experience, as it has an equal amount of upgrades and downgrades that effectively cancel each other out. If nothing else, the gameplay in this game is extremely fun. It features a lot of the same strengths as 64 and Sunshine. I brought up the insane routing potential with the moveset, which is enhanced by the exploration value throughout the game. Moons are everywhere, offering tons of reason to search around the levels for those who feel so inclined. And like I've been saying, the amazing controls make that fun in itself. There's also these purple coins that can be used to buy stuff like costumes. Oh yeah, this game has costumes, by the way. I really enjoy this edition because it's just so fun. Sometimes they're even used to get into certain buildings and collect moons, so they're relevant to what I'm talking about right now too. My favorite outfit is definitely the Sunshine themed one, because, come on. Would you expect anything less from me? Many of these moons are also locked behind some pretty neat gameplay challenges. Oftentimes you'll enter a door or pipe and be brought to what are essentially Sunshine secret stages. Only some of them look like the map CP Orange for whatever reason. That aesthetic is nostalgic for Valve freaks such as myself, but if I had any criticism with the graphics, it would be that. It seems out of place for Mario. These areas are some of the highlights of Super Mario Odyssey. Many have these challenging sequences that test your abilities with captures or acrobatics. There's simply too many to count. They're just all over the place. Certain ones can get irritating, but by and large, I like these. If it isn't one of those things, moons are usually tied to taking notes sequences, ripped straight out of Galaxy, or these parts where you control 8-bit Mario in a sort of mural. This is an example of nostalgia done right, as these are actually pretty enjoyable bits of gameplay. One of the coolest is this one in the Metro Kingdom where you played through 1-1 for an audience, but remade with Odyssey mechanics like moon shards. And speaking of that kingdom, I have to bring up the festival sequence. You run through this Donkey Kong inspired level, even beating the big ape at the end. All the while, Pauline sings the game's theme for the background. It's such a cool part of the game that I can't help but bring up. It's iconic for a reason. In general, these 2D areas are kind of like the Quark vid comics from Ratchet & Clank 3, where they're more traditional 2D platforming sections in an otherwise 3D game. They don't define the entire thing, they're used as set pieces more than anything. Boss fights also serve as objectives you get moons for, and these are without a doubt the best bosses in the entire Mario series, bar none. I've made it no secret that I don't like the bosses in these games. I find them to be a huge waste of time either way. They're either stupidly easy and thus don't add anything worthwhile, or annoying and frustrating and a huge time sink in the most obnoxious way possible. I mean, I don't want to do this stuff when I could be playing something more exciting. Odyssey's bosses more or less break this curse. Some of them are similarly pitiful, like the Brutals, but they at least progress their attack patterns the longer the fights go on. Other bosses though, some of them are actually fun to fight. I can name a few examples like the giant statue head in the ice cave below the inverted pyramid, the chef bird in the luncheon kingdom, and whatever this thing is in the Wooded Kingdom. What I love most is that, like any good boss, they test you on the mechanics you've been practicing the whole game. Some are platforming sequences, and all of them at least share the baseline of making you use the capture ability. Most aren't what I would call difficult, but every boss is at least an actual challenge that requires at least a little effort to beat. None overstay their welcome either, so they strike a pretty decent balance. I'm normally a person who's against bosses because I find them pointless, but it's games like this that show me they can work, just that most games fail miserably at them. So in general, the gameplay of Super Mario Odyssey is fantastic. It's It's very refined, polished, and in many ways this is the strongest incarnation of this series yet. However, like any other game, it isn't without its faults. I've mentioned how the capture system could have been even more fleshed out, but I also have another, somewhat more significant complaint. It's mostly related to 100% completion, the content pacing, stuff like that. It can go by many names and is hard to describe in precise words, but it all boils down to one simple thing. This game has way too many frickin' collectibles. Previous 3D Mario games had a reasonable amount of them, usually having no more than 120 stars or shines or whatever they had. Sunshine also had 240 blue coins, but those were used to buy 24 extra shines to add onto the 96 you got from elsewhere in the game. The most any of these games had was 242 stars in Super Mario Galaxy 2, but even that's dwarfed by the sheer amount of stuff in Odyssey. For many, this will be a positive because it gives them reason to keep playing the game and offers more value for the price of admission. I understand that perspective completely. However, for people like me that like playing more than just 5 games over and over and like to fully complete collectathons, then it can be a negative if the game is overstuffed with a heap of content. For me, I have to be honest, it kind of is a negative. Getting 100% completion in this game is essentially infeasible. It's so packed to the brim with moons that collecting every last one of them is daunting at best. Many of them are tightly packed away in a corner of the level, requiring some odd set of actions to get, which only increases the playtime further. Want to know how many moons this game has? It has a whopping 880 unique moons, and you can collect up to 999 if you use the shops. Guys, you think this was a little overkill? It's absolutely insane, and there's no way in hell I'm going for all of them. I have my reasons beyond just how much of a time sink it is or how much hard drive space all that footage would take up. One of them is just how many filler moons this game has. While many of the game's moons are very well thought out and placed masterfully, many are just kind of haphazardly scattered about. You look at the levels as objective lists and see that many have upwards of 50 to 70 moons in them. For comparison, Super Mario 64 had 7 stars per level, while Sunshine had 11 shines in each. Well, technically, you have 14 if you count the blue coins as shines for each stage, but still, it feels like they thought there weren't enough moons, and so they overpopulated the game with them as a way of extending its length. And just throw a moon there, doesn't matter. Just bury one there and have the player do literally nothing else but ground pound the spot. They did this so much that it started to pile up, resulting in the absurd moon count required for 100%. In many ways, it starts to feel like they prioritize quantity over quality in some areas. About 2/3 of the moons are really fun, while the remaining third are pretty much boring padding. I understand not everyone is going to agree with what I'm saying here, as I've said. I'm aware I'm probably very much in the minority on this one. Most will probably insist that Odyssey having so many moons is one of its biggest strengths, because they see more content as an unequivocal positive, and that's totally fine. I just don't personally agree with that line of thought. That of course begs the question of what I value in a collectathon game. For me, whether a game has an enjoyable 100% experience doesn't usually come down to how much content the game has, but rather how it's used. I also value replayability. To me, the best collectathons are those that can be played over and over again, with each time through the game getting better than the last as I get better at the game. These games have a reasonable amount of content and spread it out more evenly in tightly packed environments. It's why I can come back to Super Mario 64 and Sunshine over and over and never get sick of them. They have the perfect content per square foot ratio, striking a balance between collectible count and substance. The Galaxy games stumble with this by comparison. Yes, I'm aware they aren't really collectathons in the traditional sense, but I'd say it's a reasonable comparison because those games are still built around collecting stars in some capacity. They just have way too many collectibles and filler missions for me to want to bother fully completing them, making my favorite method of replaying them the any % experience. Super Mario Odyssey, by contrast, is making a return to sandbox level design, so this is more of a problem here for me. The game does have a primary campaign, and that's where I believe it's at its best. You only need around 124 moons to beat the game, which is still 4 more than 100% in the older games. If that doesn't tell you how bloated the full completion in Odyssey is, then I just don't know what will. Anyway, I don't mind that. There's a lot of moons around here as I've established, and by the end of the campaign I managed to gather well over 200 of them on this playthrough. After beating it, there's also an extra unlock at 500 moons, and for the sake of this review I also did that. However, I never even considered going the extra distance for all 880, because I don't really see the point. By the time you reach the post-game, these problems are even more evident, especially since the 100% reward is quite lacking, to say the least. This was also the case in the other games, sure, but here it's more egregious because of the sheer amount of things you have to get in Odyssey. Even getting to the 500 moon reward alone can be arduous, and it took me an additional 10 hours to do all of that after beating the campaign. Altogether, it took a grand total of nearly 20 hours. That's the kind of length you'd expect from an RPG, not a platformer, and it probably would have taken me way longer if I didn't use guides to find some of the moons, because with my limited hard drive space, I just can't afford to bumble around like a jackass for however long it would have taken. With how large these levels can get, that would be magnified even more. These are easily the biggest levels in the whole series. I'll admit, it's impressive, and I appreciate the willingness to get more ambitious. I wouldn't call any of these levels bad, and I have things I like about every single one of them. Thing is, I think they get a little too big for their own good at times, which could make navigation tedious. Let's take the Sand Kingdom for example. It's a gigantic desert stretching out for what feels like miles. If you don't have the Jaxi, which does let you run through it a lot faster, you may have to walk around to find some of the moons. You could warp with the checkpoints, but a lot of the moons are in areas between find them and aren't reachable without at least some walking. Another example is the Seaside Kingdom. Its underwater areas are a huge winding maze with caverns leading every which way. Moons are plastered all over the place, and it can be a real pain to get all of them. I'm sure many will just tell me to avoid fully completing the game. There's probably someone that will say it, but here's the thing. Collectathons aren't a genre that benefit from such an insane amount of content. If you ask me, I prefer when they have a reasonable amount of collectibles in confined environments that make 100% not a far-fetched dream, but a tangible goal to work towards. If an overwhelming amount of the game is optional, then why is there even so much stuff in the game? Maybe Odyssey wasn't intended to be fully completed, but if you ask me, that isn't a great thing for in a collectathon platformer. In these games, I like to get the full experience, because it's clear the game is built around that. Odyssey drops the ball in this regard, and I honestly think it runs into a dilemma similar to Sonic CD of all things. It feels like you're missing out on a lot if you play any percent, but going for 100% is too bloated to be worth it. In general, this feels like a game that was designed with a Switch in mind, being a game intended to be picked up and played for short burst play sessions on the go. Essentially, picking it up and collecting a few moons during a road trip or something. That's fine on its own, but as someone who primarily plays games at home, it doesn't have the same fulfillment as something like Sunshine for me. You know what I'm getting at? Anyway, once you collect enough moons, you get to head to Bowser's Kingdom, which houses his castle. The best thing about this stage is the aesthetic it goes for. Typically, Bowser's fortresses are depicted as West European style castles, but in this game, it goes for a Japanese aesthetic similar to Hands-on Hall from the last game. A neat change of pace, allowing this game to stand out even more. This level is where these birds first appear, which you can use their beaks to grab onto certain walls. At the end, you also fight the Broodals, culminating in a boss very reminiscent of Bowser Jr.'s Boomsday Machine from Super Mario Galaxy 2. Bowser manages to escape to the moon, and commands the Broodals to take Mario out once and for all. You have to take out the robot's legs, and then climb to the top of it to ground pound one of the Broodals. Do this 4 times and you win. I like the fight personally, even though it goes on for a bit, and the music is just, just slaps. Immediately after Mario takes them out, he and Cappy head to the moon to give chase to Bowser. Yep, after so many years, Mario once again makes his way into space. Once there, there's church bells ringing in the distance. Bowser's wedding is about to begin, so holy shit, man, we have to hurry. Of course, nothing happens if you take too long, I mean, in a story context. This level has the obvious choice of low gravity, except when... oh, maybe the Hollow Moon theorists are onto something after all around is a memorable finale. Mario rushes his way to the cathedral, and after I collect a couple more moons, on the moon, he crashes the wedding.
What does he want?
Bowser is understandably furious, and he opens a trapdoor leading to an arena below. It's time for the final showdown. This is honestly one of the better Bowser fights. It's not mechanically complex. All you have to do is avoid his attacks, pick up his hat with boxing gloves, and punch him a bunch. What makes it decent is the attacks themselves. I actually felt like I was putting effort in to avoid them. It only took me a couple tries, but it was surprisingly fun. Once Bowser is down, the area of the moon we're in starts collapsing, and everyone falls deep into its interior. All hope seems lost. We're stuck down here as it's beginning to collapse, with seemingly no way out. But there is a way out. Bowser is laying there, and you immediately know what's about to happen. This is without a doubt one of, if not the best finale sequence in a Mario game. I mean, come on, you get to control Bowser. How is that not cool as hell on its own? You can plow through everything in your path, and at the end of the cave have to escape from the moon by knocking down a few pillars and smashing this stone in the middle. All the while, another vocal track plays in the background, again sung by Pauline. This sequence is exciting, visually striking, and I like it a lot. I couldn't have thought of a more climactic way to end this grand journey if I tried. Mario, Peach, and Bowser end up landing near the Odyssey, and what follows is one of the series' most endearing scenes. Mario and Bowser both start competing for Peach's affection, shoving flowers in her face. She gets tired of it and ends up rejecting both of them and walking away. After that, Mario and Bowser are both left there. You can even see Mario patting Bowser on the back. It's an oddly touching moment, these two bitter enemies sharing a moment of mutual sadness. As they do this though, they see Peach living on the Odyssey. Oh boy. The two compete to reach her before the other, ultimately ending with Mario winning out and striking a pose for the camera as the credits begin to roll. All in all, it's an ending I quite like. That sequence where you control Bowser alone makes it fantastic, and the ending itself was both funny and charming. But that isn't where the game ends. After the credits, you unlock the Mushroom Kingdom, another one of my favorite levels. The moons look like power stars here, and even make a familiar sound when you collect them. Hell, there's also this one part where you can buy a costume that makes you look like Super Mario 64 Mario, which gives you access to this recreation of the courtyard. In general, this level is a homage to the game that started this series' 3D branch, and I like it a lot. By this point, I had over 200 moons, so I needed roughly 300 to unlock the last secret in the game. After defeating Bowser, these bizarre rocks located somewhere in each kingdom light up, and hitting them spawns tons more moons to collect. I personally find this point to be where those things I took issue with become more apparent, since you're basically aimlessly collecting moons now for some unknown goal. Again, not unfun, but something about it feels slightly more tedious than the campaign. Before you can play the true final level, there is one more thing to do though. It's called the Dark Side, and it's a boss rush against the Brutals and their giant mech. You have to beat all 5 bosses without dying, otherwise you'll have to restart. I remember having a rough time and quitting a couple years ago, but this time it only took me a couple tries. When I actually did it, I even managed to do the entire thing damageless. No, really. I'm not saying my crotch is huge or anything, but, you know, people who do have such a thing often tend to be able. Once you gather 500 moons, it unlocks the final level of the game, Darker Side. Once you get there, Pauline is singing a version of Jump Up Superstar with modified lyrics talking about the moon, and you have to make your way to the pipe leading into the level proper. This is the first of those huge final challenge levels I've actually played in this series. I can never be asked to unlock the other ones, and if you had to get all the moons, I wouldn't have done it here. So I decided to go for it. So how is the level? Well, let's just say I'm glad you don't have to get 100% to unlock it. I feel pretty mixed about it. For one, I like that it tries to be so challenging and tests a lot of the skills you've learned throughout the game. On the other hand, it goes on forever and has no checkpoints. If you fall into an instant death pit near the end because of some limmicky collision boxes, back to the beginning of this long-ass gauntlet you go. I get it. It's the final level and it's gonna be hard, but even the Grandmaster Galaxy had some checkpoint flags because they knew having to play the same long level repeatedly when you die would get tedious. This level was so close to being great, but in the end, it's just okay. Anyway, the true ending is really uplifting. As Mario and Cappy climb this Empire State Building clone on the moon while controlling a frog, that's a really weird sentence out of context, Cappy reflects on their journey in a very candid way. He mentions how far the two have come and how much of a pleasure it's been. As you climb the pillar on the top, he says it's been an honor walking a mile on Mario's head. An absolutely touching final line from him, to say the least. Mario grabs the final multi-moon, thus ending Super Mario Odyssey. Man, that was a lot longer than the last couple Mario videos. I guess I just had that much to say about this game. Definitely way more than I ever thought I would. In general, you may have noticed that this review wasn't as overwhelmingly positive or glowing as many others. It had a bit more criticism than most. Don't, and I repeat for emphasis, do not take that as me disliking this game. I think Super Mario Odyssey is great, and I can see why so many people call it their favorite in the series. I thought it was a solid return to the collectathon Mario formula. It was presented amazingly, the graphics are the overall prettiest in the series, the music is sensational, its controls are really precise, Cappy is a fantastic idea that's implemented really well, and I absolutely love the finale where you can control Bowser. It's a great Mario game, and a well done game in general. That being said, I have some qualms that I think most reviewers weren't bringing up. The motion controls being required to do certain things, mostly going at maximum speed for actions, is goofy and dumb. While Cappy is a great mechanic, it feels like he could be used for so much more. The levels are really well designed, but can sometimes be too big for their own good. However, my biggest issue with Odyssey is how full completion is handled. It's a game that I'd say you shouldn't go for 100% in because it's simply way too bloated for that. It has a lot of moons packed into every stage, many of which feel like they were put in there to pad out the game. Majority of the moons are worthwhile, but some are bland. It makes getting them less satisfying than, say, a star in Super Mario 64. While Odyssey has tons of potential for routing like other collectathons, I don't find it to be nearly as fulfilling because of just how much there is to do, making it hold so much less replay value than the older ones. You can summarize my thoughts on this very simply. Odyssey, from an objective standpoint, is definitely the best of the 3 games. It's hard to deny that with gameplay as polished as this. I mean, it's competing against 2 games that are 20 years old now. However, from a personal enjoyment perspective, it's my least favorite of the collectathon Mario games, honestly. Those older games were just so much fun to replay over and over again. I can come back to them any day of the week. Odyssey is a game that I have to be in the mood to play, and it probably isn't one I'll be replaying nearly as much as the others. Oh well, it's all good. I honestly think this game is my 3rd favorite of the 3 Mario games overall. The Galaxy Duo are more nostalgic for sure, but in terms of replay value, I think Odyssey beats both out. It's also more in line with my ideal picture of a 3D Mario game, so that for sure helps. So to answer the question posed earlier, I think this game holds up pretty damn well half a decade after release. You know, playing this game really makes me hope they make a sequel to it. It would be great to see a game that takes this game's framework and improves on it. One that cuts back on the collectible count while fleshing out the capture system. Hey, if Galaxy 2 can do that for its predecessor's mechanics, I don't see why Super Mario Odyssey 2 would be such a bad idea. Really, I don't know if Nintendo will even make a new 3D Mario game that isn't an expansion anytime soon, but whatever happens, I wouldn't be opposed to an Odyssey sequel. That's about it. I hope that you enjoyed watching this as much as I enjoyed coming back to this game. It was fun, and honestly, my criticism shouldn't dissuade you from playing the game in the way you want to. I personally recommend unlocking Darker Side and then stopping to newcomers, but if you want to get all 880 or even 999 moons, go nuts. I'm not going to stop you. In any event, that's Odyssey, so what's next? What's next? Let's see here. Right, so that's gonna be an interesting one and slightly embarrassing. Join me next time when I talk about a certain collection that was released around the same time I got the Switch. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you then.